The Ghost in the Mirror by John Bellairs, Chapter 11. Mrs. Zimmerman missed Rosarita at about 10 o'clock that night. She asked Hilda if she had seen her, and Hilda shook her head. Mrs. Zimmerman helped the Weiss family fold and pack sheets for a few more minutes. But she had a nagging feeling that something just wasn't right. It was hard to explain, but she had a kind of sixth sense about trouble that she had kept even since losing her witchy powers. Right now, that sixth sense was screaming at the back of her mind, telling her that Rosarita was in trouble and that she had to act fast. So she took a lantern and went outside. But before long, she peeked into the barn. What she saw made her gasp. There on the floor was a magic circle, inexpertly but accurately drawn, and there, hanging on a nail beside the stable door, was her mirror. Something rustled across the stone floor in the breeze from the open door. Mrs. Zimmerman stepped inside and picked it up. It was the magic incantation that Grandpa Drexel had translated from Albertus Magnus. It didn't take Mrs. Zimmerman long to put two and two together. She still did not know where Rosarita had gone, but she had a good idea of where she had started from. Mrs. Zimmerman went back inside, asked Hilda to come with her, and went up to Grandpa Drexel's room. The old man was very weak. His breath came in painful gasps. In a few words, Mrs. Zimmerman told him about what she had found.
"I will try to help,"
he murmured, but he could not even sit up in bed. "No," Mrs. Zimmerman said. "I know that Hilda has powers too. I hate to ask, but I need her help. I want her to use the mirror with me to find out what has happened to Rosarita." After a terrible moment, the old man nodded.
"Yes," he said. "I am sorry, my dear Hilda. It must be. I lack the strength and even the protection of the magic circle. Anyone who has no magic would run a grave risk of being detected and trapped by the maker of this infernal mirror. If you are brave enough, dear Hilda, you must try." "I will try,"
Hilda said. She went to her room, brought the crystal that she had shown to Rosarita, and then she and Mrs. Zimmerman went out to the barn. They carefully stepped inside the magic circle with Mrs. Zimmerman's hands firm on her shoulder. Hilda began to recite the magic spell. In her own hand, she cupped the crystal ball. It began to shiver with a beautiful rose-pink glow. Soon, the mirror had picked up the color and shimmered pink, too. That was reassuring to Mrs. Zimmerman, who could remember that the evil power in the mirror had a cold blue aura, not a warm, living pink one. Then the mirror darkened and cleared, as it had done once before that evening. "Oh!" Mrs. Zimmerman said. It showed a frightening scene. In a room painted in hex symbols, Heinrich Weiss was tied to a chair. A tall, thin man stood before a square mirror, a twin of the one on the stable wall, and worst of all, lying on a table before the man was Rosarita, her eyes wide, staring and terrified. The man seemed to be chanting, though the two could hear no sound.
"It is Mr. Stoltzfus,"
Hilda said. The mirror went blank, and the rosy light died. After a moment, Mrs. Zimmerman strode out of the magic circle and grabbed the mirror. "Come on," she said. "You and I have to get over there. Where's your father?" Hilda shook her head.
"He and my brothers have gone to the next town to buy a larger wagon," she said. "No one in Steinbruck would sell them one. I don't know when he will come back. It may not be until tomorrow morning."
"Then it's just the two of us." Mrs. Zimmerman tucked the mirror under her arm. "Is there a buggy or a wagon we could take?"
"Yeah," Hilda said. "The buggy is not yet loaded with the things we are moving, but Papa has the horses and the mule is too stubborn to pull the cart after dark."
The two left the barn on foot, only to meet Nicholas in the farmyard. The big chestnut horse had left the cold churchyard and come straight home. Thanking her stars that she had learned about horses and wagons when she was young, Mrs. Zimmerman soon had him hitched to the buggy. She put the mirror in and climbed up. Hilda came after her. "It may be dangerous," Mrs. Zimmerman warned. "That was black magic if I ever saw it."
"I don't care," Hilda said. "Heinrich is my brother, and Rosarita is my friend. We have to help them."
Following Hilda's directions, Mrs. Zimmerman urged the horse along the dark road. Nicholas was very tired, and the night was cold, and he was not enthusiastic about pulling the buggy, so they made only slow progress. It was past 11 when they topped the hill overlooking the Stoltzfus farm. By that time, the wind and snow had increased. Mrs. Zimmerman could see that they were in for a real blizzard.
"It's down here, or it's down there," Hilda said. "See the light?"
Sure enough, a dim reddish square showed in the light, lamplight or candlelight, shining through a window of the Stoltzfus house. Mrs. Zimmerman urged the horse off to the side of the road and tied him to a small tree. "But I have to be very careful and very quiet," she said as she and Hilda started down the hill. It was slow going in the dark night. An owl hooted dismally over and over, and off in the distance a melancholy dog howled. The cold wind whistled mournfully through the bare trees, and more snow fell on the icy sheet that still lay on the fields. Mrs. Zimmerman shivered from more than the cold. The frosty blue glimmer of the crushed snow reminded her of the flashes of light she had seen just before the red eyes had tried to blast her memory away. She still carried her mirror, and she noticed that it was shimmering with faint gleams of blue light, too. She turned its face away from her and Hilda just in case. They came quietly up to the house and circled it. One window had a shade pulled, but a little light leaked from the edge, where the shade was not quite wide enough to cover the entire window. Mrs. Zimmerman edged up to this and peeked in. What she saw made her heart feel icy cold. The scene was just as it had been in the mirror. Roswitha lay rigid on the table. Behind her, Heinrich, tied and gagged, struggled against the ropes that bound him to a chair. With his arms lifted, Stoltzfus chanted something. She could not see what he was speaking to, but it seemed to be about eye level and off to the left. Mrs. Zimmerman made the grim guess that he had hung his own mirror up on the wall and was incanting to it, opening a pathway between this world and the terrible domain of the demons. From her studies, she knew very well that such dark deeds were best performed at midnight, and it was almost midnight. "Come on," she whispered to Hilda. They crept around to the back of the house. Mrs. Zimmerman tried the doorknob, but the door was securely locked. "Get out that crystal," she said to Hilda. "I have a spell for you to work." Hilda, shivering beside her, took out the crystal. Its light was friendly and warm, still a lovely rose pink. "What do I do?" Mrs. Zimmerman paused a moment. Then, with a funny look at Hilda, she said, "This was almost the first spell I ever learned. An old woman named Granny Weatherby taught it to me. It's what a good witch uses to undo spells of binding cast by evil magicians, like the one keeping this door locked. Recite after me," and she began to whisper to Hilda the words of power that no longer worked for her. Hilda repeated them, her voice quavering. At the last word, the crystal flared up brighter, and a single thin ray shot out to touch the doorknob. When Mrs. Zimmerman tried it again, it turned in her hand, and the door soundlessly opened. Bending low, Mrs. Zimmerman whispered into Hilda's ear, "I'm going to try to bluff the old man. You have to help Heinrich get loose. Then, whatever happens to me, you children run back to the buggy and go home as fast as you can. Don't wait." They slipped along the hall to a door, through which flickering blue light showed. It was open, for old Stoltzfus was confident that no one had any idea of what he was doing. Just as they got to the door, a clock began to bong somewhere in the house, a dreadful, fearful tolling. It was 12 o'clock, the witching hour. Mrs. Zimmerman stepped inside the room and gasped. She heard Hilda stifle a cry beside her. They saw Stoltzfus's back. Before him was Roswitha, still lying face up on the table. A huge knife was stuck into the wood beside her right leg. Beyond her, hanging on the wall, was a mirror that was the twin of Mrs. Zimmerman's, and in the mirror was a horrible presence. Mrs. Zimmerman did not look directly at it, but she had an impression of ravenous hunger, of deep, dark evil and implacable hatred. She did not have to be told that she was in the presence of something demonic. Baleful power radiated from the dark image, flickering blue flashes like heat lightning on a restless summer night. The clock was halfway through its 12 chimes. Stoltzfus had not even noticed the two slipping into the room. In a high, horrible, screechy voice, he was crying out, "Azazel, or Aziel, great Aziel, I offer you drink and food for the answer to my humble question. Tell me now, and you shall drink the wine that pleases you, and eat the flesh that strengthens you. Where is the treasure I seek?" And something happened. Mrs. Zimmerman reeled. Hilda had slipped away to the right and was tearing at the ropes binding Heinrich. But Mrs. Zimmerman, behind Stoltzfus, was in the path of Azael's answer. It was not expressed aloud, nor in any language that a human ear could hear, but it washed out in a great black wave of feeling. It had no meaning for Mrs. Zimmerman, but she vaguely heard Stoltzfus cry out in triumph and glee. The last stroke of 12 sounded. Baleful red eyes, glowing like embers, stared out of the mirror on the wall, hungry and commanding and anciently evil. Without thinking, Mrs. Zimmerman held up the mirror that she still carried trying to shield herself from the hellish gaze. Instantly, she felt the power of the demon ease as she peeked cautiously around the edge of the mirror. By accident, she had held the mirror up so that it was exactly opposite Stoltzfus's mirror on the wall. She saw that her mirror reflected his, and his reflected hers. There were an infinite number of glaring red eyes, reflected and reflected again over and over. The dark power pouring out of the mirror on the wall was caught and sent back by hers. And between the two was Stoltzfus. He had already lifted the great knife high to strike. He was crying out something in a high hawk-like shriek. The knife began to plunge downward. Clang! A flying, tumbling sword struck his arm, and the knife spun away into the air. Free of his bonds, Heinrich had snatched up the sword and thrown it spinning. He screamed, "Run, Rosrita!" "No!" Stoltzfus grabbed for her arm, but Rosrita had come to life. She rolled off the table and lunged away. Dark, soundless laughter seemed to drink up all the light in the room. The mirror that Mrs. Zimmerman held pulled at her hands. It was like holding a powerful magnet that was being attracted by one equally powerful. But Mrs. Zimmerman did not know whether she should hold the mirror or let go of it. For the first time, Stoltzfus seemed to realize that intruders had broken in on him. He whirled away from the mirror, shielding his eyes, only to be caught in the hate-filled red gaze of the leering demon reflected from Mrs. Zimmerman's mirror. He tried to run, but the same awful power that he had used to hold Rosrita and Heinrich now gripped him. He screamed, "No, no, don't take me, take them instead, I command you!" The dark, silent laughter rolled again. Mrs. Zimmerman blinked. Stoltzfus was dissolving. His body seemed to be pulled in two directions at once, and it was becoming misty like black smoke. With a wailing scream, he tried to cover his eyes. Too late. His body suddenly was nothing more than a dark band of smoke connecting the two mirrors. Then the power of magic was too strong for Mrs. Zimmerman to resist. The mirror pulled free of her fingers, sped through the air, and smacked against the one on the wall. A soundless explosion of dire blue light flashed out, and both mirrors disappeared without a trace. Stoltzfus was nowhere to be seen, but Mrs. Zimmerman shivered at the thought. No doubt Aziel the demon dined well that night. And that is the end of chapter 11.